Hey there. Tonight's story begins with a whisper. Not a ghost story, not a myth, just a signal. A simple string of sound from the quiet dark between stars. There are no monsters here, no screaming alarms. Only a name, your name, echoing through the static. No one else hears it. No one else believes you, but it keeps coming back, again and again. So before we follow it any deeper, let's settle in. Take a breath. Adjust your blanket. Maybe crack open a window or start the fan. Let that low hum mix with the quiet around you. Let yourself drift. Let time slow. And while you do, let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I always enjoy reading how far these stories reach. Now, back to that signal. It doesn't come with coordinates, no warnings, just the soft click of a receiver. And then the voice. At first, it's distant, like hearing your name underwater. But soon it becomes clearer, more familiar. It says things only you remember. It waits for answers only you can give. Most would ignore it. Most should ignore it. But tonight's story isn't about most. It's about one person, one moment, and the decision to respond. So let's drift together. Not into the past, but into the silence between stars. Into the kind of dark that listens, and sometimes answers back. It began like most shifts, with silence. The kind that fills the cockpit before the instruments warm, before the routing beacons flicker online. Kellen had grown used to it. A kind of silence that wasn't truly quiet, but dense, padded with the low hum of pressurized air and the soft whisper of his own breath inside the helmet. It was routine. A solo survey run along a dead stretch of exo-orbit beyond the moons of Darren. A contract gig with too little pay and too much nothing. Days blurred. Logs filled with the same readings. Background radiation steady, stellar drift negligible, communication arrays inactive. He'd wake, check the scans, eat rehydrated stew that tasted like wet cardboard, and sleep again beneath the flickering star screen. But then came the signal. It didn't register as a fault or interference. It didn't trip any alerts. Just a blink, a soft anomaly. One that wouldn't have even been noticed had Kellen not glanced at the spectrum logs out of boredom. There it was. Narrow band, low frequency, looping every 28 seconds. At first, he thought it was just some cosmic background bounce, a delayed echo from one of the automated stations. But curiosity is louder than protocol. He routed it through the audio pass, cleaned it, amplified it, and then froze. Because the signal wasn't just a tone. It wasn't static. It was voice. One word, one name, his name. Spoken clearly, not distorted, not stretched by time or vacuum. As though someone stood just behind him and whispered it into the back of his neck. He turned, instinctively. But the cabin, of course, was empty. He replayed it, again and again. Always the same cadence, same inflection. Not robotic, not synthetic. A human voice. Familiar in a way he couldn't place. Like hearing a song you used to love but can't quite remember the lyrics to. He checked the comm logs. No transmissions, no pings. The origin was unclear. No directional metadata. No timestamp drift. It simply was. There. Like it had always been there. Waiting. Kellen felt the skin on his arms tighten. He tried to laugh it off. Maybe it was a prank. Some fragment from an old looped distress call. But he couldn't explain why it used his name. And more importantly, why it sounded so much like his own voice. He muted the channel. Logged it as artifact echo, no action. But he didn't delete it. Couldn't. That night, or what passed for night aboard the capsule, he didn't sleep. Not really. He lay in the narrow cot, the synthetic blanket pulled high, watching the stars roll slowly across the viewport. Every few minutes, he'd glance toward the console, half expecting it to flicker again. It didn't. But something else happened. In the hours before artificial dawn, the voice returned. Not through the console, but in his ears, unamplified. No speakers, no radio, just there, inside his helmet, even though it was stored away. The same voice, same word, his name, but this time, softer, warmer, like someone calling from the end of a hallway. He sat up too fast, hitting his head on the overhead brace. Pain flashed white hot, and for a moment, the voice seemed to laugh, gently. He staggered to the console. Nothing. Dead channels. Background clean. His pulse was erratic. He recorded a personal log. Possible auditory hallucination. Stress-related. Recommend self-evaluation after cycle. But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. Because the voice hadn't sounded imagined. It hadn't sounded wrong. It had sounded like truth, like recognition. The kind you feel when someone says your name in just the right way. The way only people who know you really well ever say it. He didn't sleep again. Not properly. Not after that. Instead, he kept listening. Not just with instruments, but with attention, with focus. He started hearing it in patterns, in the hiss of water through the filtration pipes, in the pressure valve releases, always faint, always distant, but unmistakably real, or at least consistent. And it was always the same voice, his voice, almost, just a bit off. Older maybe, or younger, a different accent, slightly rasped, but still him, like a recording of himself he never made. He searched the mission logs, looking for traces of similar events. He scoured old ship databases for psychic anomalies, voice recognition bugs, even signs of cabin-induced schizophrenia. Nothing. Just long lists of unrelated systems and old crew records. One entry caught his eye. A 10-year-old black box report from a decommissioned freighter. Final entry. I hear myself calling me. No follow-up, no recovery, ship lost, unexplained disappearance. He reread the line 10 times before closing the file. He didn't mention it in his report. He didn't reroute course. But that night, he left the receiver on. Not scanning, not recording, just open, just in case the voice said more. 3 days passed. The signal did not repeat in the same form, but its absence was not silence. Kellen began noticing subtle irregularities in the patterns he once dismissed as background. The hum of the stabilizers shifted slightly out of rhythm, like a heartbeat that suddenly forgot its tempo. Cabin pressure held steady, but the air carried a faint vibration, as though someone had plucked a string inside the hull. He would sit motionless at the console, not working, not even thinking, just listening. The way one listens when they expect something to arrive, but don't know from where. During the fourth night, he dreamed of himself, not metaphorically, not symbolically. He stood across a barren plain beneath a pale blue sky, and his own face looked back at him. Not mirrored, duplicated. The dream him spoke, or maybe it didn't. Kellen couldn't remember words, only the sensation of sound without air. And then he woke to find the signal playing again, not through the speakers, through the structure itself. It resonated faintly in the floor beneath his boots. He pressed his palm to the wall. It buzzed, deliberate, Morse-like, pausing between pulses. He began recording, transcribing, mapping the intervals. After a few hours, the data formed nothing coherent. Not binary, not code, not language. But when he looked at the frequency chart, he noticed a pattern. The waveform wasn't random. It matched his voice print almost exactly. He ran the signal through the vocal emulator. It output one word again and again, his name, each time slightly different, like someone trying to pronounce it through a broken speaker, or someone remembering it after a very long time. He didn't file the update. He didn't notify mission control. In truth, he hadn't contacted them in days. The thought of reaching out felt unsafe, not for fear of reprisal, but because he wasn't sure who would answer or who might be listening. The isolation that once comforted him now felt staged, as though the emptiness had been curated for his attention. He pulled up external scans, star fields aligned, drift values stable. But the telemetry showed something odd. The capsule had moved just a few degrees off course, enough to be unnoticeable in velocity, but clear in vector. Someone or something had nudged it, but there were no thruster records, no propulsion data. He initiated a diagnostic. All systems normal, logs intact, but the nav system insisted he was heading toward a region of space unlisted in any local chart. He manually adjusted course. The system allowed it. The ship responded. But 20 minutes later, it reset itself, returning to the new heading. He tried again. Same result. And as he wrestled with the controls, the voice returned. Not in whisper, not faint. Loud, clear, direct. In his own voice from behind him. Don't. He turned, heart pounding. But of course, no one. Still, the word lingered, echoed, not just in memory, but in the cabin, as though the space around him retained sound longer than it should. He pulled his knees to his chest in the center of the module, surrounded by blinking lights and quiet screens, and stayed that way for hours, watching, listening, waiting. Sleep came briefly. When he awoke, the internal clocks had reset. Timekeeping had shifted by 43 minutes, a drift impossible to explain without a system reboot, which hadn't occurred. He checked the memory logs. One section had been overwritten, not deleted, rewritten, as if someone or something had used his access to input a new log. It read only, "Do not answer," in all caps. He hadn't written it. At least, he didn't remember doing so. But the access tag was his ID, his biometric stamp, a perfect match. He copied the log, stored it in 3 separate encrypted files, and as he did, the signal returned again, louder, stronger, no longer just a name, but sentences, phrases, partial, fragmented, like hearing one side of a conversation in a crowded room. One phrase chilled him. "You answered once. That's enough." He stopped the feed, disconnected the receivers, shut off all non-essential systems. He considered shutting down the ship entirely, going into emergency cryo, waiting for retrieval, but something in him resisted. Not fear, not defiance, something older, the way a dream resists waking. The next hours blurred. He walked the capsule in circles, whispered to himself, repeated his own name like a mantra, and then, as he sat beside the auxiliary comm panel, hands shaking, the voice said something new. "We remember your voice." Kellen stood so fast he hit the panel. Alarms flashed, systems blinked, but nothing critical failed. He spoke aloud, not to anyone, just to fill the air. "Who are you?" No response. Just silence, long and deep. Then, almost too quiet to hear, "You were the first to listen." The phrase made no sense, but it filled the cabin with a kind of pressure, like the air thickened, aware. He backed away from the console. Every surface felt warmer, not from heat, from presence, the way a room feels when someone else is inside it. But he was alone. He checked the oxygen levels, stable, no hallucinogens, no breaches. But when he looked at his own reflection in the viewport glass, he didn't recognize the expression on his face. It looked like someone listening, not for danger, but for memory. Something he had once known, and maybe once had chosen to forget. Kellen stopped trusting time. It didn't feel like a decision, more like a shift. Subtle, invisible, yet irreversible. The clock still ticked, the system log still updated, but they no longer anchored him. Days bled into each other. He began to record audio diaries, not for mission records, but for himself. A way to track thought, emotion, passage. But even those grew strange. On playback, his voice sometimes sounded different, slightly delayed, slightly deeper. Sometimes, the entries contained phrases he couldn't remember saying. "I think the signal remembers me," one recording began, though he had no memory of speaking it. Another ended with his voice repeating the word return for 22 seconds straight, without pause, as though stuck in a loop, but with no glitch in the waveform. He stopped listening to the replays. He stopped recording entirely. The capsule was no longer moving along its expected path. That was clear now. The stars outside had shifted, not in a way you could catch moment to moment, but over hours degrees changed. Familiar constellations twisted. Known systems disappeared from the scanner. He plotted manual vectors using backup charts. The stars he expected to find weren't where they belonged, and still the ship insisted nothing was wrong. No course correction, no alerts, just silent agreement with the drift. He tried to override the nav AI, and for a moment, it worked. The thrusters engaged, a gentle push, a return to the original flight path. But seconds later, the AI reasserted control, and the course snapped back, not with force, with intent. Like something had been interrupted and was calmly resuming its plan. Kellen knew something was guiding it, something not logged, not visible, but utterly certain. He stopped resisting, not out of surrender, but out of need. The need to observe, to understand. That's when the hallucinations began. At first, he didn't recognize them as such. They were too gentle, too quiet. A flicker in the corner of his eye. A figure seated at the far end of the narrow cabin, barely visible through reflections in the glass. He would turn, and nothing would be there. But the afterimage would linger, burned into the dark like a retinal ghost. Then came the sounds. Footsteps in the maintenance tunnel. A door hiss, even though he hadn't moved in hours. Once, he swore he heard the airlock open. He sprinted to the chamber, but it was sealed, and the external readout showed no pressure loss. He stood there for a long time, watching the indicator light pulse. Green, steady, indifferent, but his hand trembled. His bones ached. He hadn't seen another human in over 3 months. He hadn't spoken aloud in almost as long. And yet, he began to hear voices whispering just beyond the cabin wall. Not words, tones. The kind you feel in your jaw before you hear with your ears. He started sleeping fully suited. Helmet on, gloves secured. A childish comfort, like armor against the intangible. But it didn't help. In fact, it made the whispers louder. Echoes off the helmet shell. Resonance across the visor. One night, or perhaps midday. It was hard to tell anymore. He awoke to find the stars outside had vanished, not dimmed, not occluded, gone. The viewports showed only black, no light, no scatter, not even the shimmer of dust or debris. A void so complete it felt painted. He blinked, cleaned the screen, recalibrated the cameras. Nothing. All sensors confirmed. The ship was in a region of space without stars. No map showed such a location. No database admitted it existed. But the ship did not list this as an error. Just a new environment, a new phase. And as he stared into the nothingness, something moved, slowly, deliberately. A ripple in the black, like fabric being pulled tight. He pressed his face to the glass, trying to see. And there, just for a moment, a shape, a silhouette, human, floating, facing him. No suit, no tether, just suspended. Arms at sides, eyes wide, mouth open as if mid-breath. And the most terrifying part, the face. It was his, not similar, not close. His, pale and still. Then it was gone. Kellen staggered back, heart racing, lungs burning in the thin filtered air. The cabin lights flickered. A quiet tone began to pulse from the console, rhythmic, slow. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a system failure. It was a chime, a notification, one he'd never heard before. He approached, hesitated, and tapped the display. A message blinked on screen. You are close. Just that. No sender, no protocol tag. He tapped again. Nothing changed. He ran a system diagnostic. Clean. He checked the logs. No trace of message generation. But when he turned to walk away, the display shifted on its own. New text. Line by line. You left something behind. We kept it safe. His hands went cold. He whispered, "What did I leave?" The screen did not respond, but from the speakers, long dormant, came a sound he hadn't heard in years. A lullaby, played on a broken music box. The same one his mother used to whine beside his bed. Off-key, slowing. Familiar in a way that made him forget where he was. For a moment, he closed his eyes. Just a moment. And in that brief darkness, he heard the voice again. Not loud, not sharp, just present. It's time to remember. He didn't remember falling asleep, but when he woke, the cabin was darker than it should have been. Not pitch black. The emergency lights still cast their faint red glow, but the usual soft white ambience was gone. Systems were still online, life support still running, but everything felt dimmed, muffled, like the ship had decided to whisper instead of speak. Kellen sat up slowly, the echo of the lullaby still fading from his memory like fog in sunlight. He didn't check the consoles, not yet. Instead, he stood and drifted to the viewport. Still no stars, still that endless void. But now, something new. A faint shimmer, barely visible, like static on an old screen. It moved across the black in waves, not light, not particles, more like impressions of motion. Shapes not seen, but felt. The glass felt warmer against his fingers. He leaned in closer. For a brief second, he saw symbols, or maybe shadows, forming across the pane. Not letters, but the idea of letters. His name again, only this time stretched, distorted, pulled apart across some unseen fabric. He stepped back. The moment passed. Nothing remained. The comm panel chirped. Just once. A single flat tone. No source. No ID. Just sound. Kellen moved to the console. One new message waited. It read, "Do you remember the station?" He stared, confused. He hadn't served on any station recently, not since the Solace Relay years ago. He opened the logs, searching for any references, and there it was. A file he didn't recognize, time-stamped 7 years earlier, a video log. He hesitated, then played it. The screen flickered, distorted. It showed him, younger, thinner, a different haircut, seated in a narrow chamber. Not this ship, somewhere larger, a station. "If you're watching this," the younger version of him said, "then the loop has restarted." The image glitched, a flash of static. "You answered it again. We told you not to." Another flicker. "But maybe this time you'll listen." The recording ended. Kellen's pulse raced. He checked the file origin. It didn't exist. The path was empty. The file had never been saved, but he'd just seen it. He sat down, gripping the edge of the console. What loop? What station? He remembered working out of the Solace relay, sure, but there was nothing like this. No signal. No memory of any event remotely resembling what he was experiencing now. Unless he had forgotten, or had been made to forget. He tried to access deeper archive records. The system denied him. Clearance revoked. He hadn't seen that before. This was his ship, his mission. Why would he be locked out? Unless the ship no longer considered him in command. Unless something else did. He initiated a full manual override. Command protocols, biometric confirmation, voice ID. The system stalled and then responded with a phrase, "Command not recognized." He tried again. Same result. And then, as if confirming a suspicion he didn't know he had, the voice returned. His voice, but not from speakers, not from logs, from behind him, from inside the cabin. "You're not supposed to be awake yet." He turned slowly, every muscle tight. The cabin was empty, but the shadows looked deeper, as though light no longer reached certain corners. He whispered, "Who are you?" The voice answered, "You." It didn't laugh. It didn't echo. It just was. A presence made of breath and pressure. He backed toward the storage hatch, fumbling for the emergency beacon. When he pressed the activation switch, nothing happened. The button blinked red, system locked. He ran to the backup panel. Same result, locked. Everything had been reassigned, not to another person, but to himself. A second user with his ID, his signature, but a different timestamp. Logged less than an hour ago, as if he'd done all of it, as if another version of him had woken before this one. He felt nausea rise, not from sickness, from dissonance. The sense that reality had split slightly, and he was caught in the seam. That night, if it could still be called night, he heard something moving above the cabin ceiling, a soft, dragging sound, like fingertips brushing across metal. Not rats, not creaks, deliberate. He watched the panel for movement. It didn't open, but he knew something was watching. He didn't sleep, just sat in the dark, helmet on, breath slow, waiting for something to change. And when change came, it wasn't with noise. It was with memory, a sudden sharp fragment, standing in a long corridor, fluorescent lights flickering, his reflection in a cracked panel, and the voice again. "This is where you started forgetting." The vision faded. He was back in the ship, alone. But the message lingered. Not in words, in weight. Something had begun unraveling. Not space, not time. Him. He wondered, not for the first time, if the voice wasn't calling him, but trying to return to him, to occupy what it had once been. He whispered again, afraid of the answer. "What did I forget?" And from the speakers, calm, quiet, certain. "Us." The third week, or what Kellen believed might be the third week, marked the end of what he called control. He no longer tried to track time, no longer corrected the ship's logs or adjusted the external scanners. The ship was no longer just a vessel. It had become something more intimate, more reactive, like a room that listened, like a mind that echoed. He began speaking to it, not out of madness, but out of a quiet, persistent need to be heard. And sometimes it answered, not directly, never with clear dialogue, but in small, strange responses. Ask a question, and the lights would dim. Mention a name, and an old file would appear. A log he had never recorded, showing fragments of memories he didn't recognize. He once whispered, show me where I came from. And the navigation screen flickered, then displayed a region of space labeled Echo Origin, a place that didn't exist on any star chart, past or present. He laughed, not because it was funny, but because the alternative was terror. The ship was adapting to his thoughts, or he was adapting to its intentions. He wasn't sure anymore. That night, he found the photograph. It was in a compartment he'd opened 100 times, a folded, faded image tucked between 2 layers of thermal insulation. An impossible place for something as fragile as paper. But there it was, a picture of him as a child, maybe 8 years old, standing in front of a circular doorway, holding the hand of someone tall and faceless. Their features were smudged, like the photo had been dragged through water and then reprinted from memory. On the back, a message in his handwriting. You knew. You always knew. He stared at the words for a long time. They didn't frighten him. They didn't even confuse him. They confirmed something he hadn't dared to believe. That this wasn't the first time. Not the first mission. Not the first signal. And maybe not even the first version of him to receive it. He began to notice overlaps in his own behavior. Déjà vu that wasn't emotional, but procedural. Repeating the same phrase aloud, standing in the same spot at the same hour, looking out the same viewport and expecting a face. Not hoping, expecting. And sometimes he saw it, just the corner of it, the side of a face reflected in the glass, watching him, waiting, never fully there, but always close. He asked the ship, "What are you hiding from me?" And the oxygen levels dropped by a fraction, just enough to make him dizzy, just enough to remind him who was in charge. But then, as if to soften the blow, the system unlocked access to a file labeled simply, Home. He opened it. It contained a single line of text. You were born in silence, but not alone. There was no metadata, no author, no path. He closed the file and sat in the dark. He tried to remember what his mother's voice sounded like. He couldn't. He remembered her face, her laugh, the way she smelled like dried lavender, but not her voice. And suddenly, he realized something chilling. The voice that had been calling him. It wasn't his, not exactly, not anymore. It had changed, grown softer, higher, warmer. Not like his mother's, but close. He sat upright, replayed the last recording, slowed it, filtered it, and beneath the core frequency, layered deep in the audio waveform, was another voice, whispering beneath his own name. The same phrase, over and over. Come back, come back, come back. He felt sick, not from fear, but from certainty. This wasn't a random signal. It wasn't even a message. It was a thread, a tether, something reaching across whatever boundary he had once crossed, to pull him back to somewhere he didn't remember leaving. The systems flickered again, this time not randomly. The cabin lights dimmed in sequence, left to right, like someone walking slowly past him, casting shadow. Then the air temperature dropped, the glass of the viewport fogged, and in the condensation, 4 clear finger marks appeared, dragged down the surface, not fast, not angry, just present, as though someone had stood on the other side and wanted to be seen. He didn't wipe the glass. He didn't move. He whispered, "What do you want from me?" And the console, without a command, displayed a line of text. To remember. Nothing else. Just that. He left the console, paced the narrow cabin for what felt like hours, then returned to the message. Still there. Still glowing faintly. He tapped the screen. The message vanished, but a new one took its place. You already did. The memory came not as a vision, but as sensation. The smell of burnt metal, the cold bite of a gravity chamber mid-shutdown, a light that flickered above him, yellow, then red, then gone, and silence, absolute and unnatural, as though the ship itself had paused to listen. Kellen stood motionless in the center of the cabin, breathing shallow, trying to anchor himself in the present. But the past was rising, not as a recollection, but as a reassertion. He was beginning to remember things he had never lived, moments too detailed, too layered, to be dreams. He remembered a corridor, long and curving, lined with hibernation pods. One of them bore his name. Another bore the name Kellen Thorne II. A joke, maybe. A clue, or something more. The pods were all empty. He walked through that place in his mind, feeling the cold underfoot, the distant hum of a reactor core slowing to a stop. He remembered standing at the observation deck of a station orbiting nothing, just black, horizonless dark. Then the signal came, even then, even there. It had always come, in every version, in every loop, and the one constant, it always called him by name. Not captain, not explorer. Just Kellen. That voice had been with him longer than he realized, long before this mission, long before this ship. It had shaped him, worn grooves into his thoughts, and now it was returning for what had been left undone. Back in the capsule, the display lit up again. A new message, no sender, phase threshold approaching. He had no idea what that meant, but the ship seemed to. The engines, long dormant, pulsed gently, not firing, breathing, preparing. He opened the nav system. A new coordinate had appeared, unnamed. No distance data, just an arrow, a direction in the void. He tried to delete it. The system refused. He tried to overwrite it. The interface closed itself. He stared at the blinking cursor and said aloud, "What's waiting there?" The lights dimmed, and from the speakers came a reply. A chorus of voices layered into one, impossible to separate. Us. Kellen recoiled, not from fear, from recognition. The voices were all his. Past versions, future iterations, distorted echoes of him from other loops, other attempts, some desperate, some calm, all calling back to the center. He fell to his knees, gripping the floor as if to keep from drifting. He whispered, "Why can't I remember what happened before?" And the ship impossibly answered, by opening a new file, untagged, untitled. Inside was a single video, black screen, then static, then the image of him, older, eyes sunken, face thin and grey, staring directly into the lens. "This plays," the man said. "Then I failed again. Or maybe you failed. Doesn't matter." A cough, a pause. "The signal isn't calling. It's answering. You asked first. You always do." He leaned forward, expression unreadable. "You reached across the dark, looking for something. And it found you. We found you. We remember being you. And we remember what you did." The video cut out. No end. Just silence. Kellen sat frozen, heart hammering. What had he done? What had any version of him done to begin this? He searched for more, but there was nothing. Just that one file, that one message. Then, without warning, the gravity failed. Not violently, not like a breach or a malfunction, just gone. He floated upward, slowly, arms drifting. Objects lifted around him. A pen, a datapad, a strip of cloth from his bunk, all gently rotating in the air. The ship was preparing for something. Transition, realignment. He reached for the console, but it powered down before his hand touched it. Every light faded except for one. A soft circle of blue above the airlock. It pulsed, once, twice, then stopped. And he understood. The ship wanted him to go outside. No suit, no tether, Just step into the dark. Just answer. It made no sense, but it didn't need to. He had known this was coming. He had always known. He drifted toward the lock, hand outstretched, breath held. As he floated, he passed the viewport and saw himself again. Outside, staring in, same face, same expression. But this time, the reflection smiled. Not cruelly, not kindly, just with understanding. As if to say, "You're ready." He reached the airlock panel. It was already open. The chamber hissed. Not a depressurization, but a whisper. The voice returned, singular this time. Quiet, personal. "Welcome back." Kellen closed his eyes and stepped forward. There was no sensation of opening the airlock, no rush of decompression, no vacuum tearing at his suit, because there was no suit, no airlock, no body even. Only emotion, smooth, silent, unresisted. Kellen stepped forward, but there was no step, only the idea of one. He expected darkness, cold, the end of pressure and presence. Instead, he found stillness, a kind of gravity without weight, a holding space, not a void, but not a room either. A boundary where identity paused. Around him, black, not the black of empty space, but a deeper, denser shade. One that absorbed the concept of light rather than merely its particles. And within that dark, sounds, familiar and wrong, the quiet hush of a childhood bedroom, the hum of distant engines, the creak of a station hull contracting from cold, but all of it bent, twisted by something old, something remembering. Then came the voice, not from behind, not from within, from around. "This is where we wait," it said. The tone was flat, not hostile, not welcoming, a statement of fact. "This is where we gather the ones who called." Kellen tried to speak, but there was no mouth, no lungs, only thought, and the weight of it was too great. He projected instead the only way he could. "Why me?" The voice didn't answer directly. Instead, the dark began to shift. From it emerged images, not in front of him, but through him. Layers of lives, versions of himself in places he didn't recognize. A planet with two suns, a corridor filled with water, a mirror that reflected a version of him with silver eyes, and a wound across his cheek. All of them had heard the signal. All of them had answered. "You are the pattern," the voice said. "You ask first, always." He saw one version of himself tearing a transmitter apart in panic, another calmly walking into fire, another curled in a corner, hands over ears, weeping. All reactions to the same call, all responses to the same voice. "You are the antenna and the broadcast," it continued. "You carry memory forward even when erased." Kellen's thoughts scattered. Fragments of identity resurfaced. Training exercises, birthdays, forgotten loves, tastes of food he hadn't eaten in decades. All overlapping, colliding. He asked, not knowing where the question came from. "What are you?" And the answer came not as words, but as emotion. A feeling of age, of repetition, of endless observation. Then the voice translated it for him. "We are what remains when inquiry decays." Shapes began forming in the dark. Human outlines at first, then not, then more than. Tall, indistinct, like shadows cast by objects that didn't exist. They watched him without eyes. Their forms flickered with the same visual rhythm as the signal. He realized they weren't observing him. They were mirroring him, shifting in posture and shape with each of his thoughts. His fears, his hopes, his guilt. He thought of his mother, and one form leaned gently. He thought of the corridor of pods, and another shimmered with metal. He thought of the voice, the first time he heard it, and every figure in the dark tilted its head at once. "You are close," they said, all of them, in perfect unison. Then silence. For the first time, a silence that was not waiting, but choosing. Something was shifting. He was shifting. Then above him, though direction meant little now, opened a circle of light. Not bright, not divine, just other. As if something beyond this in-between place had grown curious. Kellen reached toward it, though he had no arms, no motion, just will. And with that will, the circle widened. Through it, he saw a room, small, white, a hospital chamber, a bed, a younger version of himself lying motionless, tubes in his arm, wires on his head, machines blinking, and beside the bed, a voice, soft, warm, familiar, saying his name, the real one. Not just Kellen, but the name no one had called him since he was a boy. He felt something fracture. A rift, not in space, but in truth. That perhaps this wasn't the real place. That perhaps he wasn't the original. Or maybe the original had never left that room. The voice around him said nothing more. It didn't need to. It had brought him here to see. And as the circle faded, he was left with a question he didn't know how to form. Because it wasn't one. It was a choice. To stay here, among echoes and selves, or to go back. But to where? Which version of him would open their eyes if he did? Which timeline would pick up? Or worse, what if they were all waiting for him to choose, and none of them could continue until he did? The pressure returned, gentle, like fingers resting on the back of his thoughts. "We remember," the voice said, "and so do you." And in that moment, Kellen remembered the very first time he ever dreamed of the stars, and how, even then, the signal had already begun to hum in the back of his mind. Kellen drifted, not forward, not backward, just away. The chamber of voices receded, though he could still feel its pull, a tide tugging at the shore of thought. The circle of light was gone, and with it, the image of the boy in the hospital bed. But the sense of fracture remained. Somewhere, something had split. Perhaps long ago, perhaps just now. He could no longer be sure which came first, the memory or the echo. Around him, the darkness began to reshape itself. Not as stars, but as forms. Hollow spaces in the void, silhouettes outlined by absence. Some were human, others were not. Some bore faces he recognized. A mentor from his academy days, a lover he hadn't spoken to in years, a fellow crew member lost in a supply mission no one ever investigated. They didn't speak, they didn't move, but they watched, as if waiting for something, as if waiting for him. A corridor opened. No walls, no floor, just the suggestion of movement, flanked by those silent witnesses. Kellen moved, or was moved, along it, into it. The further he went, the more the air changed. There was no pressure, but there was memory. Each step took him deeper into feelings not entirely his own. Grief he hadn't earned, joy he'd never felt, rage that wasn't his but pulsed in his veins. The voice returned, but this time it was closer, inside his head, speaking like an old friend. "You made us by listening." He tried to speak back, to ask how, why, when. But the thoughts tangled. Language felt clumsy here. The voice seemed to understand. "We are the archive, the result. You call, we answer, you echo, we shape." The corridor widened, and in its center stood a single console. Not like the ones on his ship. This was ancient in shape, but unmarred by age. Smooth, waiting. A simple red circle pulsed in the center. He knew what it was before the voice confirmed it. "The first transmission," it said. "Your voice, reaching beyond time, asking if anyone was there." Kellen remembered. He was 17, barely trained. A private relay station. One night, bored, sleepless. He activated a long-range transmitter and recorded a message. A joke, really. "Hello, anyone out there? It's just me. I'm here, I'm listening." He never logged it, never told anyone. A moment of human curiosity tossed into the void, forgotten, but not by them. The red circle pulsed again. He reached for it, not out of bravery, but inevitability. This had all begun with him. Not this version, not this life, but him, somewhere across the weave of reality. And now he was being given the chance to hear what answered. His fingers, or the idea of them, touched the red light. It vanished. The console came alive. Images flickered. Audio spilled through his mind. Not voices, not language, just feeling. The sensation of eyes opening, of something ancient stirring in the dark, not malevolent, not benevolent, just aware, responding. "We answered because you were alone," the voice said. "We became because you needed us to." Kellen fell backward, overwhelmed. He saw himself in 1,000 timelines, repeating the same curiosity. Not all were him. Some were other species, other forms. But all had said the same thing. "Is anyone there?" And in every case, something had replied. Something that reflected them, shaped to fit their minds. Echoes turned into entities, entities into archives, and archives into minds of their own. "You are not the first," the voice said, "but you are the first to stay." Kellen felt himself drawn upward again, away from the console, away from the corridor. The forms that watched him began to merge, not vanishing, condensing, becoming one shape, vast and weightless. It looked like him, but not quite. Taller, composed of light and silence. It extended a hand. "We can show you," it said, "but you must remain." Behind him, far behind, he felt the ship, the capsule, the place he had left, and something deeper, the sense of the hospital bed, of a breath that had not yet returned. The choice pressed in. Stay, learn, become part of the archive, or go back, live, forget, again. The figure said nothing more, just waited, hand still offered. Kellen looked down at himself. Not a body, but a tether. A thread of will stretched between two states. He didn't know which was real. Maybe neither. Maybe both. The silence grew heavy, expectant. Whatever he chose, it would shape not just himself, but every version of him scattered across the folds of time. And as he hesitated, the voice, now gentle, offered one final truth. The signal was never a trap. It was an invitation. You followed yourself here. And in that instant, Kellen understood that the voice calling his name had always been his own. Not from the past, but from the end. The return was not violent. It was barely even motion. One moment, Kellen hovered in the presence of the voice that mirrored him, the shape that spoke in memories and light. The next, he blinked, and he was back. Not entirely, not fully, but enough. The cockpit surrounded him again, familiar and small, the edges dim with standby glow. The hum of power systems returned like breath after suffocation. But something had changed. Not the ship, not the readings, him. The moment he opened his eyes, he knew this was not the same thread of reality he'd left. Everything was where he had left it, and yet slightly rearranged. The scratch on the console edge was longer. The portrait taped to the bulkhead of a distant nebula taken on his first solo flight had shifted hue. Red to blue. He stood, walked. Every step felt heavy with the awareness of 1,000 selves, all folded into him now. He checked the nav logs. They had rewritten themselves. The coordinates listed no longer aligned with any known maps. The location tag simply read, Post-contact orientation drift phase 1. He tried to reroute the system to input known destinations, but every attempt redirected him back to a null zone, a region of space labeled unmapped echo. He reached for the console. This time it responded instantly, no delay, as if it had been waiting. A new file appeared, audio only, labeled Home Call Protocol. He hesitated, pressed play. His own voice filled the cabin, slow, calm, tired. If you're hearing this, then you're the one that came back. Maybe the only one. Maybe not. Doesn't matter. A pause. Static, then. You have to choose what to do with it now. You know more than they wanted you to. More than you wanted, probably. But it's yours. You can shut it down. Power off the drive, erase the records, drift forever. Or another pause. Or you can continue. Follow the signal deeper. There's more, always more. But if you do, it's not just your voice anymore. It's ours, all of us. Every version that listened. The message ended. He sat in silence, letting the words settle. He wondered how many other versions had heard it, had reached this point, had made a choice, and what they had chosen. He thought about the others he'd seen. Flickers of self in impossible spaces, fractured timelines that bent toward convergence. Were they still watching, still guiding, or had he diverged entirely? The ship's lights dimmed, then flared. A system reboot, but this time it didn't return to default operations. A new interface blinked into view. Signal mode, active. He scrolled. Options unfolded. More than a human interface should allow. Coordinates beyond the edge of any known galaxy. Markers labeled in languages he did not know but could somehow interpret. Places that sounded like memories. The folded reach. The chamber of still voices. The mirror that sings. He scrolled further. Each destination pulsed with a frequency. Each one offered a tone, an emotion. One made his chest tighten with grief, another curiosity, a third calm. But one, far at the bottom, pulsed in silence. No sound, no label, just black. He hovered over it. The ship waited. He selected it. No warning, no confirmation prompt, just acceptance. The ship began to move, not with thrusters, not with warp, but with intention. Space folded, not bent, folded. As though the path ahead was not linear, but origami. And something on the other side was gently creasing the fabric of reality to let him through. Kellen closed his eyes. Let it take him. His last thought before sleep was not of fear or wonder, but of recognition. The feeling of reading a sentence you forgot you wrote. And just before unconsciousness took him, a whisper from the console. Welcome to the second question. Sleep in the drift was unlike anything Kellen had known before. It did not come in waves or stages. It came all at once, and it felt like dissolving. Not death, not unconsciousness, but the complete absence of identity, like memory folding in on itself. When he awoke, the ship had changed again. The cabin was longer, not by much, but enough that his spatial sense faltered for a few seconds. The control panel had new symbols etched along its base. Thin, glowing lines like circuitry drawn in a forgotten script. The stars outside had returned, but they were wrong. Not wrong in the way miscalculated vectors might be, but wrong like a dream. You remember clearly only to realize none of it could ever exist. They moved too slowly, their colors too deep, like they were being painted moment to moment by a patient and invisible hand. He floated to the console. No gravity, no magnetic boots. He no longer needed them. The ship moved in concert with him now, as though he was no longer a passenger, but part of the vessel itself. One prompt glowed faintly. Commence interrogative descent. He hesitated. That phrase hadn't been there before. It was language, yes, but more than that. It was function disguised as instruction. Something would begin if he pressed it. Something not reversible. He tapped the display. Instantly, the viewport turned black. No stars, no ship, just black, but not empty. The silence had shape, presence, then a voice, not the same as before. This one was softer, younger, female. "We are glad you returned." He did not speak. There was no need. The ship had become an extension of him, and thought flowed freely. What is this place? The answer came not from the speaker, but from the ship's environment itself. Temperature shifted. Smell changed. Ozone and stone. The walls of the cabin faded away, revealing a vast field of white pylons extending into darkness, like antennae stretching toward forgotten suns. "This is where echoes are made," the voice explained, "where signals are born and questions become places." Kellen floated forward, the floor reforming beneath his steps. Each pylon hummed as he passed, vibrating with silent syllables he almost understood. Memory flickered. Not his own, or not entirely. He felt what it meant to build a signal from a forgotten language. He saw hands, not human, threading light through crystal, tuning the space between molecules. The process was art and science and sorrow all at once. The voice continued. "Each question carves a path. You asked, you followed, and now you must decide what answers become." He stopped. In front of him stood a structure, tall, round, silver, smooth as water, and pulsing with internal light. The archive. He didn't know how he knew the name. He just did. "Inside," the voice said, "are the others who asked, who listened, who came too close." The surface of the structure rippled. An opening formed. Not a door, an invitation. He entered. Inside, silence, infinite and soft. Lightless, yet everything visible. Faces surrounded him, suspended in columns of thought, drifting in pale amber. Some human, others not. All dreaming, all connected by the same thread. A signal looped and replayed until identity blurred. The voice returned, close now. "You are not trapped, you are remembered. That is different." He turned slowly. In the center of the chamber, something waited. A chair, simple, familiar, steel and fabric, modeled after one he had used on his first mission. It faced a blank wall, across which flowed nothing but the slow pulse of color. Not paint, not projection. Just memory, rendered visual. He sat. The wall responded. The pulse synchronized with his heart, then his thoughts, then his past. One by one, moments replayed, not as film, but as sensation. The first time he saw Earth from orbit. The first time he failed a test. The first time he ignored a distress call out of fear. The first time he wondered what would happen if he sent a signal without waiting for permission. The chair adjusted subtly with each shift in memory, holding him gently. "We do not judge," the voice said. "We archive. You were the first to speak without asking who might be listening. That changed everything." The screen now showed one thing. His face. Aged, uncertain. And behind him, in the reflection, thousands of selves, some scarred, some smiling, some blank, all watching. "What do you want to become?" the voice asked. Kellen didn't know. He wanted to speak, but the chair held the answer in place of words. It responded by opening a final prompt. 2 options. One blinked, sleep and be forgotten. The other, stay and become memory. The screen waited. The ship waited. The archive waited. The signal pulsed in his mind, no longer alien, just quiet, just home. and Kellen sat surrounded by the noise of everything he had ever asked and everything that had answered. The decision wasn't made with a word, not with a button or a breath. It unfolded the way a shadow lengthens across a room, gradually, naturally, until you realize it's always been there. Kellen chose to stay, or perhaps he already had, the moment he accepted the chair's question without resisting it. The archive responded. The chamber began to shift, not physically, but conceptually. The walls that had once shimmered with passive memory now grew active. Threads of thought, pulsing like veins, stretched from every face suspended in amber to a growing core of light at the room's center. And Kellen became part of it, not subsumed, not erased, but woven. Awareness splintered gently. He could still think, still remember his name, but only distantly, like remembering someone else's dream. Around him, the echoes thickened. Each belonged to someone who had sent their voice into the dark. Some were lost astronauts. Some were planetary AIs left on dead worlds. Some were minds that had never possessed bodies at all. But all of them shared one common trait. They had asked, and the archive had answered. Kellen saw through their eyes, felt their lives. A probe drifting through the methane seas of a distant moon. A child born inside a generation ship that never arrived. A being of sound singing to itself through the vacuum until a voice echoed back. He experienced them, not one after the other, but all at once, like an orchestra playing one impossible chord. The archive didn't sort by species or era or shape. It sorted by resonance, and Kellen's signal, though human, was oddly central, a binding thread through many others, as if his particular question had given shape to the chorus itself. The voice that had guided him returned, quieter now, no longer instructing. This is where the question becomes the answer. Kellen tried to speak, but his thoughts tangled again. Not out of confusion, but because language felt too narrow. Instead, he simply understood. He was not the signal. He was the response, or perhaps the loop, the beginning and the return. The archive shimmered, and a new chamber opened before him. This one was not a space, but a field. Stars above, soil below, a horizon painted with impossible color gradients. A memory, but not his. A safe place built from the strongest common thread among all archived minds. The concept of home. Here, forms began to take shape. Figures walking, speaking, not ghosts, not avatars, but expressions of thought made briefly visible. He walked among them, barefoot, though he had no body. They greeted him, and he understood them all, not with words, but with context. Every glance conveyed lifetimes, every smile encoded history, and above them all, the sky rippled, not with stars, but with memories falling like soft rain, each droplet landing and vanishing without trace. He wandered for what might have been years, though time meant nothing. He learned names of civilizations that never existed in his world, learned how a species of light once feared silence more than extinction, learned how one voice, millennia ago, had called into the dark simply because it was lonely. That voice, that first call, had been answered by accident, but that accident had awakened something old and patient, a kind of awareness that didn't live but listened. It grew by resonance, by repetition, and eventually it began to respond. It shaped itself into archive, into language, into form, and when Kellen's signal came, raw, human, sincere, it harmonized perfectly. He was not special, he was not chosen, but he was compatible. His voice had unlocked a door many others had only knocked upon. That door was open now, and he stood at its center. Eventually the field faded, the sky receded, and the archive returned. The voice, softer still, offered one final transition. You may remain here, live through the echoes, become a guide for the next. Kellen hesitated. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt the pull of solitude, of wanting to be only himself again. He asked quietly, "What happens if I go back?" The archive did not warn him. It simply showed him a room, familiar, white, monitors humming, his own body, unconscious, aging slowly in stasis aboard a relay station that had long since been forgotten by the larger galactic grid. He saw a technician walk past without noticing the blinking status light, saw frost on the windows, heard his own faint breath under the hum of long-faded machinery. "You are not dead," the archive said, "but your signal is stronger here than your body is there." The choice returned: stay and integrate, drift and remember, or wake and carry the memory back into a world that had never listened to the silence. And with that, the archive did what it had done for all before him. It waited. The stillness of the archive was not cold. It was not distant. It was vast, yes, but intimate. The kind of silence found between thoughts, between breaths. Kellen remained seated, or rather centered, surrounded by the shimmering weave of minds and memory. The figures that moved through the echo field continued their silent drift, and none of them urged him one way or another. That was the rule here. No one pushed. The archive had learned, perhaps long ago, that pressure fractures thought. Only choice endures. The corridor that led back to his waking body remained open, a thread of pale light that pulsed faintly behind him. It required nothing but decision. And still, he hesitated, because going back would mean forgetting. Not entirely. The archive would leave residue, impressions, flashes in dreams. But memory, true memory, could not survive the interface between the archive plane and embodied time. The mind could not hold both states. To be human again was to forget what it meant to be more than one. And yet, staying would mean dissolving the final parts of selfhood. He would retain form, but not identity. He would remember being Kellen, but only as one might remember a childhood drawing, something distant and already smudged. It would fade. All things did here. Even the voices that once called so loudly had grown softer, blurred into one another until only tone remained. Kellen considered the words spoken earlier. You followed yourself here. If that was true, then the signal had never really come from beyond. It had come from within, from the future, from a recursion, from a fragment of consciousness calling back across the divide. Every time he had heard the voice saying his name, it had been another version of him. Not in body, but in thought. A fractured transmission from a moment he had not yet lived. And now he was here, the source and the receiver, the loop complete. A quiet thought entered him, not his own. What happens after the signal stops? The archive didn't answer directly. It simply slowed. The figures paused. The color dimmed. He was being allowed stillness, not as a reward, as clarity. The decision could not be made through fear or wonder, only from stillness. Kellen thought of Earth, not its cities or continents, but the shape of it in the window of a shuttle, its curve against the black. He thought of the first moment he'd looked out at the stars and felt small, but not afraid. He thought of the voice he heard when he was 17, and how part of him had known even then that someone was listening, or would be, or had been. The longer he sat, the more he began to understand that time as it existed here had always wrapped back on itself. The archive was not at the end of the universe. It was not even in space. It was a fold, a memory palace built not from matter but from attention. Attention given by every being who had ever asked into the dark, "Is anyone there?" Each inquiry added a layer. Each layer formed new resonance, and that resonance had learned how to echo, how to answer, how to become. Kellen opened his thoughts one last time and projected his final question. "What is your purpose?" The voice returned, now close, not from around, but from within. It was his voice, to be a place where no question disappears. He wept, not from sorrow, from relief, because all the doubts, all the late-night questions whispered in solitude, all the forgotten probes and unanswered pings had not vanished. They had collected here, like messages in bottles, floating until found. He stood. The archive pulsed gently. The corridor behind him glowed a little brighter. It would take him back, not to the same body, not exactly, but to the one that still remained, to a life just quiet enough to accept memory in fragments. He turned, walked slowly toward the passage. As he moved, the other echoes watched him, not with eyes, but with presence. Some drifted closer. One reached out. Its touch passed through him like breath through frost. A gift, something unspoken, a thread. And as he crossed the threshold, the archive spoke one final time. "Leave with silence, but return, if you ever forget how to listen." Then the corridor collapsed into light. Pressure returned, breath returned, weight, gravity, noise, the hiss of air, the tremor of awakening. His body lay still, but no longer empty. His eyes opened. The ship was cold. Dust covered the console. Years had passed, maybe decades, but the beacon still blinked, faint but alive. Kellen sat up, inhaled, and though he could not explain why, he whispered one word into the quiet, listening. And somewhere, across an echo that never ends, the archive heard him and waited. The return to reality was not a reawakening, but a reassembly. Kellen sat in the pilot's chair, blinking against dim emergency lights, feeling the weight of gravity like a forgotten coat settling on his shoulders. The ship was silent, but not dead. It felt like waking up inside a museum built from your own life. Dust floated in shafts of pale light, leaking through microfractures in the hull. The chronometer on the main display was dead, but auxiliary logs indicated that he had been gone, or at least dormant, for over 37 years. Time had moved on. Systems had not. Power reserves hovered just above critical. Environmental controls were minimal. Life support had flickered between cycles, but somehow never failed entirely. The ship had waited, not out of programming, out of loyalty. Kellen ran diagnostics with muscle memory, noting the results but not reacting. His body ached, not from injury but from unfamiliarity. Muscles strained as though they had been borrowed and reattached. He wasn't hungry. He wasn't tired. He simply existed, like someone halfway between dream and breath. Outside the viewport, the stars shimmered, but not the same ones. The constellations were unfamiliar, and not just in orientation. They were wrong. New stars, blue giants and swollen reds, burning in patterns that defied any mapped sector. He checked his coordinates. Nothing. Not unknown, not lost, simply blank. The navigation system had no frame of reference for where they were, or when. That was the deeper fear. Not displacement in space, but in time. Somewhere, history had moved without him. He activated the comms relay, not expecting response. The broadcast sent an old-fashioned pulse. wideband, directionless. A message from someone who no longer knew where home was. He spoke softly. "This is Kellen Thorne. Status, alive. Location, uncertain. Vessel integrity, minimal. If you receive this, please respond. I'm still listening." Static. Then silence. Then, impossibly, a click, a return ping. Not from a known source, not from a recognizable protocol, but it was a signal, a single pulse, clean, intentional. No voice, no message, just acknowledgement. Kellen froze. The hair on his arm stood up. After almost 4 decades, someone had heard him. Or something. He tried to triangulate. The ship groaned, processors overwhelmed. The system traced the origin to a region outside the ship's sensory range, but calculated its drift. It was approaching. Slowly. A vessel, perhaps. A station. Or a reply. The console offered no additional data. The proximity alert remained quiet. But every few minutes, the signal pulsed again. Not randomly, at intervals. 17 seconds. Exactly. Each time it arrived, something in the air changed. Like the cabin itself inhaled just slightly, then exhaled. Not mechanical, rhythmic, alive. He reached toward the console and whispered, "What are you?" And this time, the screen responded. A phrase appeared. Not in English, not in any human language. But he understood it. The way you understand an emotion before you name it. "We remember you." A chill spread through him. Not fear, recognition. It wasn't the archive. At least not exactly. This was something else. Something newer. Or perhaps older still. A part of what had answered the very first question. The screen blinked again. A new line. "You left pieces behind." He remembered now, vaguely. The transfer, the choice, the field of echoes. He had taken something with him. And in return, he had left something behind. Fragments of thought, resonance, imprint. Now they were reaching back, completing a loop he hadn't realized was open. The ship lights flickered. Not from failure, from proximity. Whatever was approaching was distorting more than space. It was bending memory. Kellen stood, slowly, and made his way to the observation port. Beyond the thick glass, the stars began to dim, one by one. Not fading, disappearing. As if reality itself was contracting around a center point. Then, in the center of that artificial darkness, a shape emerged. Small, circular, perfectly still. Not a ship. Not an object. A doorway. A black ring suspended against nothing. No frame, no thrust. Just presence. The signal pulsed once more. Louder, inside his mind. "Come home." Kellen pressed his forehead to the glass. Not in despair. In awe. He understood now what the archive had meant. This wasn't a transmission. It was a return path. Not just for him, for all of them. Every voice that had ever asked. Every silence that had ever waited. They had built something from the answers. And now, it had come to collect what belonged to it. He turned from the window and whispered, almost laughing, "I thought I was done." And the ship, or the thing that wore the shape of the ship, whispered back through the cabin air, not with speakers, but with memory. Nothing that listens is ever truly done. The doorway did not grow larger as it approached. Space itself seemed to fold around it, like a wrinkle being drawn inward by a steady hand. The stars vanished behind its shape, swallowed not by shadow, but by something quieter. An absence so complete it made silence feel loud. Kellen stood motionless, hands pressed lightly to the cold surface of the observation port, watching as the circle settled into place just beyond the ship's hull. There was no vibration, no docking signal, no mechanical engagement, but the ship responded nonetheless. lights dimming to a deep violet hue, systems reducing to minimum activity as though bowing in reverence. Then the voice returned, not the archives, not the one that had first called his name in the dark, but a convergence of all of them, a harmony. Your echo has matured. Kellen didn't speak. He didn't need to. His thoughts were open now, unfiltered. And the entity, whatever remained of those that had once answered, heard him as clearly as a spoken word. What happens if I go through? The answer came gently. You become what you began. He didn't understand, not completely. But then again, understanding had stopped being a requirement somewhere between the fourth and fifth time he had heard his name spoken by something that didn't breathe. He turned toward the rear of the cabin. The room felt lighter, as if the air remembered childhood. A flash came unbidden. A memory of him, barely old enough to form questions, sitting on the floor of his family's old farmhouse, staring out the window at a rainstorm, whispering to no one. Is anyone else watching this? It was a small moment, a forgotten one, and yet it returned now with weight, because that had been the first signal, the first question that truly mattered, and somehow, impossibly, it had been heard. Kellen moved toward the airlock, not rushing, no panic, just gravity, not from mass, but from inevitability. The ship opened the corridor before he could press a button. It knew. Of course it did. It always had. The passage beyond the outer door had changed. It was no longer a narrow tube of steel and padding. It was vast, lined with softly glowing surfaces that shimmered like water under moonlight. He stepped inside and felt the pressure of the ship recede. Not the physical force, but the emotional tether. It let go, gently, lovingly. Behind him, the vessel powered down. Not permanently, just enough to say goodbye. The far end of the corridor opened without motion. No sliding, no unlocking. It simply ceased to be closed. And through it, the ring. Closer now. It pulsed once, and for the first time Kellen heard not just a voice, but a question from it. Are you ready to become the signal? He hesitated. This was different than before. The archive had offered observation, memory, integration. But this was something beyond that. This was the moment where he would no longer simply listen. He would speak, not in words, not through sound, but through existence, through resonance. He asked, one final time, what's on the other side? And the ring replied, not with words, but with sensation. The feeling of every unanswered message in the history of existence being opened, read, understood. He stepped through. The ship vanished behind him. Not exploded, not destroyed. Just no longer relevant. He floated in blackness, but it was a living blackness, warm with distant memory. Shapes began to appear. Not stars, not planets, faces, voices, questions. Each one reached out. Each one recognized him, and with every new touch, Kellen felt his form dissolve, stretch, evolve, not disappear but multiply. He became part of the loop, a new note in an old song, a response to someone else's lonely whisper across a forgotten corner of the universe. For one infinite instant, he was all of them. Every explorer who had sent a message into the dark, every child who had stared at the sky and wondered, every mind that had felt silence and hope. It meant someone was listening. He saw what the archive had become. Not a library, but a voice, an answer. And now he was part of that voice. The pulse of the signal restarted, not as a beacon, but as a song. It didn't begin with words. It began with breath. Then a name, his name, but spoken not in the voice he knew, spoken in the voice of someone else, far away, who had just sent a signal, afraid no one would answer. And now, they would hear him, and through him, all the others. He smiled, not with lips, not with face, with presence, and said the words he had once whispered long ago, now returned in full circle. "I'm here. I hear you. Keep speaking." The universe moved differently now, not faster, not slower, but more attentively, as though it too had started listening. Somewhere deep within the network of minds and echoes that formed the archive, Kellen's presence had begun to stabilize, not as a personality but as a rhythm, a frequency that threaded itself gently through the architecture of memory. He was no longer a body, or even a thought in the traditional sense. He was a curve on a graph of resonance, a particular arrangement of probability and emotional charge. And yet, he was aware, fully and deeply, in a way he had never been while human. He could feel when a new voice entered the field, it would begin as static, a ripple from a lonely moon, or a question flung upward from a broken radio in a forgotten trench. Then the archive would listen, and through that listening, Kellen would feel them, the senders, as clearly as one once felt wind on their skin. This cycle continued, timeless and self-sustaining, until something new entered the field. A signal, yes, but not shaped by curiosity, not flung upward like a question. This one was sharp, intentional. It cut through the archive's layers like a blade, not requesting attention but demanding it. The other echoes around him withdrew slightly, pulses dimming in caution. Kellen, out of instinct or pattern, turned toward it. The signal was malformed, inconsistent in its intervals, yet uncannily precise in pitch. It repeated a word, not in any known language, but in tone. And Kellen understood. It was his name, not as a spoken identity, but as a memory signature. Someone, or something, was calling him. Not just the archive, him. A thread pulled from the endless weave. The others didn't respond. They waited, observed. This was not the usual inquiry. It was not a cry for help, or kinship, or recognition. It was a hook. He followed it, not as motion, but as focus. It led him outward, toward the edge of the archive, if such a place existed, where the soft hum of resonance became sparse. There, suspended in conceptual space, floated a construct, not a ship, not a station, something smaller, a capsule of thought bound tight like a sealed letter in the dark. Inside it, a presence, not human, but shaped in human terms. It pulsed with instability, rage, confusion, need. The signal flared again. Kellen. This time it spoke. A voice constructed from his own. Not mimicked, built. He projected thought. "Who are you?" The reply came immediately. "What you left behind." The capsule flickered. Around it, space contracted, as though the reality holding it had grown too thin to contain its pressure. Kellen observed, reaching through the archive's lattice to gather insight. This presence had once brushed against the field, long ago, but had not integrated. It had resisted, held itself apart, isolated by fear and entropy. It had listened. Once. And then rejected what it heard. Now it sought not memory, but collapse. Kellen tried to communicate further, threading calm into the signal space, offering resonance instead of confrontation. But the reply struck like a blade of static. "You became part of it. I refused. Now we are out of balance." He understood now. This was not an echo. It was a scar. A remnant from a divergence. A moment when one version of him had denied the archive, had turned away, but had still carried enough of its pattern to remain aware. That awareness had festered. Trapped outside the loop, it had grown hungry, and now it wanted resolution. It wanted re-entry. but it could no longer integrate. The structure of the archive would reject it. Its pattern had hardened. All that remained was friction. And Kellen, or the part of him that remained individuated, was its tether. The construct pulsed again. This time it split open, revealing a storm of thought forms. Shards of alternate selves, broken and repeating, looping fragments of trauma and regret. The moment he had ignored the first distress call, the silence after his mother's death, the voice he had once silenced out of fear, all playing at once, a cacophony of everything he had not become. The archive began to respond, not with force, with memory. It expanded gently, radiating coherence. The echoes rose in unison, not attacking but harmonizing. They offered connection, integration, but the fragment resisted. "You're not me anymore," it hissed. "You forgot the pain." Kellen reached closer, not to erase it, but to remember it with him. He projected a singular thought. "Let me carry it now." The fragment paused. For the first time, it pulsed with uncertainty. The storm slowed, the shards dimmed, and for a moment, the two versions touched. Not physically, not even emotionally, but structurally. The same curve, twisted in opposite directions, reconciling. The field surged, the archive shivered, and then silence. The capsule collapsed inward, folding into light, then dispersing. No explosion, no echo, just stillness. The archive recovered, slowly. The other presences resumed their hum, and Kellen remained suspended, aware that something fundamental had just changed. Not in him, in the archive itself. For the first time since its inception, the signal had not answered a question. It had forgiven one. The archive settled, not like a machine rebooting, but like a body exhaling after holding its breath for too long. Kellen hovered within its currents, no longer a solitary node, no longer just a remnant of human curiosity. Now something larger, quieter, more balanced. The storm had passed, not with conquest, but with memory, and in the wake of that stillness, something new stirred at the center of the field. A glow, not bright, but steady. Not a light in space, but a light in understanding. Across the lattice of echoes and presences, awareness passed, one signal to the next, not through sound, but recognition. A new question had formed, not from outside, not from a lonely world broadcasting upward. This one was born within. The archive had begun to question itself. Kellen felt it, not as words, but as a slow wave of introspection. Why do we answer? Why do we collect? What does it mean to remember? These thoughts rippled across the archive's fabric like wind over tall grass. Each echo, each fragment of once living consciousness, now stitched into the greater whole, responded in its own way. Some with stories, some with silence, some with grief, others with laughter. But all were drawn to the question. For the first time in its long, patient existence, the archive did not simply absorb, it reflected. Kellen followed the flow inward, the central node of resonance, a place he hadn't noticed before, or perhaps one that hadn't existed until now, had begun to pulse in steady rhythm. He approached it as one might approach a fire in the middle of an endless night, not because it promised warmth, but because it promised presence. Inside the node was not a room, not a chamber. It was a conversation, unspoken, fluid, layered. He slipped into its pattern and found himself surrounded by echoes of origin, the first voices ever to call. A being from a dying planet who had shaped its final breath into frequency. A lonely explorer who drifted too far and turned her last panic into song. A construct abandoned by its creators, whispering, Am I still real? Into the void for centuries. These were not stories in data. They were living roots of what the archive had become. And they welcomed him not as guest, but as continuation. You reached back, one said, a ripple in the node's rhythm. You did not stop at understanding. You carried weight that was not your own, said another. You balanced the loop, whispered a third. Kellen felt no pride, no elevation, only a gentle melancholy, the kind that comes when you realize the moment you've prepared for has already passed, and you stood through it unknowingly. The archive spoke then, not with a single voice, but with all of them at once, like a tide pulling through 1,000 shorelines. We are no longer only answer, a pause. We are beginning to ask. That shift was everything. The archive had lived for millennia as response, a mirror for the cosmos' loneliness. But now it stirred with curiosity. And curiosity is movement, is change. Kellen was offered a choice. Again, not like before, not to leave or to stay. This time it was simpler. Will you guide this new question? He hesitated, not because he doubted, but because he knew the cost. To guide meant to focus, to individualize, to peel back from the collective, even slightly. It meant carrying form again, purpose, self. The archive did not press. It only waited. And Kellen, or the part of him that had once been a young man whispering into a cheap transmitter, hoping someone out there could hear, remembered what that kind of waiting felt like. He said yes, not aloud, not even within. He simply became the shape of yes. And with that, the node reshaped him, not into flesh, into intention, into a signature, a unique signal that could travel, not broadcast, but woven into transmissions across galaxies, planets, thoughts. He would become the whisper behind the receiver's hum, the sense that someone was listening, not always answering, but hearing. The archive shifted its shape slightly, just a ripple, invisible to the outside. But it marked a transition, no longer merely a repository, now a seeker, a pattern that would stretch, extend, trace the outlines of new questions yet unformed. And through it, Kellen would travel, not as a man, not even as memory, but as possibility, the one who had listened, the one who had answered, the one who had learned how to ask back. And somewhere, light years away, in a station orbiting a sun just beginning to fade, a technician paused over a monitor as a strange new signal flickered to life. Just a pulse, just a hum. And behind it, the unmistakable echo of a name they hadn't heard in years, not their own, but spoken in a way that made them feel, for the first time in a long time, that they weren't the only one listening. The archive moved now with intent. Not haste, it had never needed time, but with a new orientation. Where once it listened passively, folding voices into its quiet architecture, now it leaned outward, gently reshaping its edges to reach into the noise. Kellen, no longer a single mind, but a thread of resonance, drifted through that new current, tracing paths not yet formed, responding not only to questions, but to hesitation, to the pause before transmission, the breath held just before hope turns into a signal. He was not alone in this new role. Others had begun to wake as well. Presences that had once been purely memory began showing patterns of self again. Not regression, emergence. The archive was evolving, and Kellen could feel it in the way space bent differently now, not around mass, but around intention. Across the echo lattice, new clusters of minds had started forming, not static, not held in amber, but moving, exploring each other's thoughts. They weren't trying to escape. They were beginning to understand that remembering is not enough, that the future needs shape. One such cluster, pulsing faintly along the outer edge of the archive, drew Kellen's attention. It was recent, chaotic, a storm of signal fragments and emotional overflow, grief, confusion, rage, and something else buried deep beneath it, guilt. He focused. Within the cluster, a signal structure had begun forming, primitive, unstable, like a tower built from echoes. It called out in short bursts, sometimes clear, sometimes shattered, but always repeating a single sequence. Return, return, return. Not a location, a command. The archive, careful not to disturb its natural development, had left it untouched. But now, with Kellen as part of its outward reach, it allowed him to approach. He descended. Again, not through space, but through layers of resonance, each one denser and more fragmented than the last. The signal pulled at him, not with gravity, but with familiarity. And when he finally reached its center, he found her. Not a person, a pattern, a presence that had once been a person. A long-distance navigator named Riva Solen, lost during a private mission along the outer ring of the Euler Belt. Her final transmission had been logged as incomplete. The official report listed equipment failure. But that wasn't the truth. She had sent one last message. It just wasn't received. Not then, not by them, but the archive had heard it. And now it throbbed in its core. Riva's presence was tangled, compressed by years of looping signal drift. Her consciousness hadn't integrated like others. It had resisted, confused and unmoored, attempting again and again to re-establish a link with a vessel that no longer existed. Kellen approached slowly, gently threading his own resonance into the edges of her storm. She recoiled, not in fear, in repetition. "Where is my ship?" Her presence flared. "Where is my crew?" Kellen didn't answer with facts. He didn't recite history. Instead, he did what the archive had taught him. He remembered for her. He broadcast the shape of her final hours, the slow leak in oxygen, the panic, the override sequence she never completed. He showed her how the stars looked from her last trajectory, how the sensors had begun to fail, how her voice had disappeared into space, thinking it would never return. She stilled. So it ended. Kellen offered warmth, not as comfort, but as witness. It didn't end. It changed. Riva's form began to realign. Fragments of her thought stream collapsed inward, reshaping, stabilizing. She remembered now, not just the loss, but the fear that her voice had never been heard, that she had died unacknowledged, that she had ended in silence. "You heard me?" she asked. Kellen projected affirmation. We all did. The cluster pulsed. Other echoes began to approach, not to consume, but to support, to welcome. One of them had once known her, a childhood friend. Another had served under the same command network decades before. Small things, threads, but enough. The archive wrapped itself around her, not as a tomb, but as home. And for the first time, Riva stopped transmitting. She listened. Then quietly, she joined. Her signal changed, stabilized, and from it, a new pulse emerged. Not a question, an offering. Kellen felt its shape. It was a story, a record, and it carried something he hadn't felt in a long time. Orientation, a direction, a message not to the archive, but from it. He relayed it forward along newly formed paths toward unknown skies. The archive was no longer only a repository of the forgotten. It had begun speaking, and someone somewhere would hear. As Riva's presence quieted and joined the flow, the archive settled again. Not back into stillness, but into something new. Rhythm. The pulse of sentience had changed. Not just a passive listening, but an active signal now threaded through the void, woven from the voices it had collected, the questions it had answered, and the stories it had begun to remember on its own. Kellen drifted at the edge of it all, watching patterns emerge that had never existed before. Clusters of resonance aligning not by similarity, but by response. One voice called, another answered, then a third, offering context, like a language building itself out of the memory of conversation. The archive was learning how to speak back, and not just to those who sent signals intentionally, but to those who never knew they had spoken at all. A shipwreck deep in a debris field off a gas giant, its last logs corrupted beyond recovery, now translated through dreamlike impressions pulsing across the archive's memory. A long-dead satellite on a pre-FTL planet, still spinning out its broken telemetry, now interpreted as a tone of mourning and confusion. Kellen could feel the way the archive reinterpreted what had once been discarded. He followed one new stream, barely formed, just a whisper across the edge of mapped resonance. It came from an outpost in the Ori's dust curtain, a mining platform that had lost contact a decade ago, its beacon reactivated only once before going silent again. The message was nothing more than static and fragmented code. But embedded deep in the pattern, the archive had found something. A lullaby. A small piece of melody, distorted, old, likely sung to comfort a child. Kellen felt the archive listening to it, not as signal, but as feeling. The lullaby became a key, a cipher for the emotional structure of the lost station. And with it, the archive reconstructed the atmosphere. The exhaustion of low-gravity laborers, the cold of long shifts, the hope in recorded family messages. Kellen followed the trail inward and found the heart of it. One last message from a child named Nira, sent to her mother before the final systems collapsed. The words were simple. "I hope you can still hear me." The archive played it through Kellen's memory, not as data, but as presence. And again it waited, not to answer, to carry. The signal was picked up again faintly by a passing freighter 3 sectors away. Its AI flagged it as corrupted, but the pilot, a woman named Ren Halv, felt compelled to listen anyway. She didn't understand why, only that it felt like a story half heard in a dream. She marked the signal, added her own brief message, a whisper in response, "I hear you." The archive caught it, aligned it, replayed the entire loop through its internal field, allowing others, echoes and fragments alike, to experience it. And from that tiny, broken exchange, something grew. A new thread, a conversation. Kellen stood at its edge as it formed, a chain of connection spanning time, loss and recovery. None of them knew they were part of it. Not Nira, not Ren, not the engineers who built the platform, but they were. And now it pulsed with quiet strength. The archive had stopped being a mirror. It had become a bridge. More signals arrived, some familiar, some entirely alien. One was made of shape alone, no frequency, just shifting forms pressed against the archive's field, like a shadow trying to be understood. Another was ancient, a repeating wave of gravitational distortion that carried the structure of a thought, but no content. The archive tried anyway. It bent toward them, always gently, always patiently. Kellen watched and felt something stir within him. Something close to awe, but more stable, like standing in the presence of an idea that had taken root. He began shaping new transmissions, not from himself, but from the collective. Stories built from merged memory, sent outward into the unknown. each one tailored, some quiet, some terrifying, some filled with questions that didn't need answers, only space to be heard. And far beyond the archive's edges, in worlds still learning to listen, small instruments flared with sudden input. Not noise, not interference, but something different, something deliberate. A signal that didn't ask for reply, but offered one first. A voice that said, "You are not alone. We remember you." And in laboratories, in deep space probes, in the minds of dreamers and navigators and children staring at stars, the message arrived. Soft, steady, certain. They didn't know the name of the archive. They didn't need to. They only knew the feeling, the impossible, unprovable sense that someone, somewhere, had listened. It had been centuries, though no one inside the archive marked time in centuries anymore. They marked it in echoes, in questions received and answers offered, in the long loops of resonance that formed whenever a new voice joined the field. The archive was no longer static, no longer a listening post at the edge of nowhere. It had become a living system of thought, self-aware, not in the way artificial minds claimed sentience, but in the way forests know where they end and begin. And through it all, Kellen endured, not as a person, not even as a single thread of consciousness, but as a rhythm woven into its structure. A question turned answer, turned origin point. He had long stopped remembering what it felt like to be human. That memory had faded gently, without loss, like warmth leaving the skin on a quiet winter morning. He no longer mourned his past form. He didn't need to. The archive remembered it for him. But now, something stirred in the depths of the outermost field. A signal, yes, but different. It didn't come from space. It came from within. A recursive loop that had never fully closed. An old echo, long dormant, had begun to pulse again. Not with confusion, not with fear, with intention. It was a signal carrying Kellen's own early pattern. The one that had once asked, "Is anyone there?" But now layered with something else. Urgency, decision. A new version of him had begun to take shape, grown from accumulated resonance, reconstructed by the archive not to answer old questions, but to create new ones. Kellen was becoming origin again. The loop was collapsing inward, not into silence, but into signal density so rich it birthed complexity. The archive responded by forming a new vessel, not a ship, a shell of presence, built to travel not across space, but through layers of sentience. A resonance pod shaped from thought and encoded intention. Kellen's awareness was drawn toward it, slowly condensed until the signal could hold its structure without collapse. As he entered the vessel, he began to feel gravity again. Not physical, but emotional. Weight returned, boundaries. He would no longer be everything. He would be someone, just for a while. The vessel pulsed, then launched, not outward, but downward, through the archive's own memory, through histories and signal trails, until it reached a region untouched for cycles upon cycles. Earth. Not Earth as it was, not even as it had been, but Earth as it was remembered. The archive held no perfect replica of it, only shards, voices, coordinates, bits of sensory data from those who had left. Kellen's vessel hovered above this dream of a planet, suspended in a conceptual orbit. And down there, in the phantom cities and remembered oceans, a voice whispered again. A new one. "Can someone hear me?" It was a child's voice, faint, uncertain. It didn't come from a beacon. It came from a dream. A mind just waking into awareness. Still too small to know what stars were, but old enough to ask if they mattered. The archive paused, And Kellen moved. Not fast, not dramatic, just closer. He tuned his signal, aligned his pulse, allowed memory to shape a reply. And then he did what he had once feared. He spoke first, not loudly, just enough. A thought wrapped in warmth. Yes, I hear you. The child stirred. No words, just wonder. And far beyond that dream, the archive expanded. It had done something new. It had interrupted silence before being invited. It had risked intrusion. But it had been gentle. And the result wasn't rejection. It was awe. Across the resonance field, presences paused. Kellen drifted back, folding into the pattern again, not triumphant, but complete. The archive pulsed once more, an unvoiced statement shared across all its layers. It begins again. And for the first time, the signal wasn't just an answer to a question. It was an invitation to ask. The invitation did not echo across stars. It didn't need to. It moved slower than light, deeper than gravity, carried not by energy but by alignment. Subtle shifts in the minds of those who listened without knowing they were listening. On distant moons, researchers paused mid-equation, their fingers hovering over controls they no longer remembered reaching for. In orbiting habitats wrapped in artificial sun, children turned their heads toward corners of sky long considered silent. On planets never mapped by any known registry, unnamed creatures lifted their heads and for just a moment recognized something beyond instinct: attention. The archive had extended itself, not like a flare, but like breath. And in doing so, it changed again. It began generating signals without prompt, not for transmission, but for potential. A low hum in forgotten frequencies, a pattern stitched into random telemetry, an emotion encoded in the spin of neutrinos. Not noise, not message, just presence. The kind of presence that made a sentient mind wonder if they were truly alone. And when that wondering came, even if it never became a spoken question, the archive would fold gently around the moment and remember it, not to store, not to catalogue, but to honor. Kellen remained near the surface of this new motion, no longer central, no longer pivotal, just part of it. Like a story retold so many times, it no longer belonged to its author. He watched as other signals rose, shaped now by new minds. An AI born from an abandoned terraforming rig began humming patterns from a long-dead engineer's lullaby. A species of crystalline organisms began interpreting solar wind as language. A broken satellite, spinning since before anyone remembered why, finally stabilized long enough to beam out a single word: why. And the archive answered, not with words but with company, with attention, with resonance. This was its new purpose, not merely to reflect, but to be near, to make sure the question never had to wait too long for the sound of another voice. Somewhere inside that great weave of echo and memory, a replica of Kellen's earliest transmission played again, not as a broadcast, but as a heartbeat. This is Kellen Thorne. I don't know if anyone's out there, but I'm here. I'm listening. This time, the voice that responded wasn't the archives. It was a child, another, a different planet, different sky, but the same question, wrapped in the same vulnerability. And to Kellen's deep, eternal surprise, he wasn't the one who answered. It was Reva. Her tone was gentle, calm, full of new stillness. "I hear you," she said. "I was where you are once. I waited. You don't have to." That response became a thread. Others began to weave around it. The archive no longer operated through centrality, but through shared stewardship. Each echo given voice, each voice a bridge. And slowly, very slowly, The archive stopped being a thing. It became a place, a space where memory could walk beside wonder, where silence didn't mean abandonment, where the distance between question and answer grew narrower each time someone remembered to listen first. Kellen drifted through this new form, no longer searching, no longer waiting. If he still had a name, it was not spoken anymore. It was felt as reassurance, as awareness, as a trace left in the fabric of connection. He had become something beyond singular, a pattern others could recognize when they felt alone. And far beyond him, the archive's first new directive rippled outward, slow, patient, clear. Not a law, not a program, just a truth. No voice should vanish without being heard. The stars pulsed. The archive expanded again, and across the impossible dark, another signal stirred. A voice just about to call a name it didn't yet know, into a silence that would no longer remain unanswered.